Much is made today in the 21st century, especially in the era around 2020 or so, about a youth movement in our society that largely espouses many of the policies in and around politicians like Bernie Sanders and whatnot. Typically, they're considered a bit far left, maybe more of your socialist agenda. You have a political movement that refers to itself as being democratic socialist. Typically, those are people who uh, fight for true economic equality, social equality, political equality, uh, social justice, that sort of a thing. Um, Oftentimes, folks in this movement are referred to as social justice warriors. Oftentimes, college campuses are the epicenter for this type of movement. So, from that perspective, typically younger folks are more likely to espouse the idea of various different aspects in radical leftism. And that's not a criticism of any sort, one way or the other. It's just more likely to be the case. Oftentimes, among democratic socialists, if you will, those who likely are going to believe in the ideals and espouse the ideals and support the beliefs of somebody like a Bernie Sanders, is typically going to come from a middle class to upper middle class white society. Okay, the numbers bear that out. And so many people make various different claims as to whether or not maybe it's a form of white guilt and they want to do something about that. Maybe they only know other white people who also come from reasonably wealthy and well to do type situations and they just see the wrongs of that and they try and take their view and espouse it into the macro view of our entire society. I don't know. All I know is that there is a youth movement that largely supports the idea of radical leftism and quote unquote democratic socialism. I believe they're well intentioned. That's not where the majority of the country is, though. Never mind conservatives or the far right, which is a whole different story. Most Americans are somewhere towards the center from a political standpoint. They might lean a little bit left or maybe towards the right or whatnot, but nonetheless, most Americans have reasonably similar ideals with a few subtle differences that seem greater than what they truly are. And oftentimes you have extremes on one side of society being the loudest voices. And that's one of the reasons why I personally believe that you see so much division in our country, why you see such a bisected society and all this anger. A lot of it comes from your extreme sides of the political spectrum. In the meantime, when most of us are kind of towards the middle, we just, you might hear one side, and well, yeah, but no, just stop the politics, stop the screaming. I think that's what most of us are saying. That's nothing new in American society. That is nothing new. That's not something that only exists in the era of 2020. This has been going on for a long time in our country. Really, you can make a very strong case that this has been going on since our colonial and independence movement days. However, as pertaining to the decade of the 1960s and on into the 1970s, you have a youth movement that's kind of similar to what you see today. So 50 years ago, you have a lot of college age students, largely influenced by academia and the college side, who espouse the idea of youthful change, a bit of a rejection of traditional middle class societal norms. Why do things have to be a certain way? And it's good that they're questioning these things because not everything should be as hunky dory perfect as they're made out to be because they're not. There are injustices in this world. There are injustices that we can do better. It's what these folks in the youth culture do that sometimes define how that movement actually happens. So, in the decade of the 1960s, you saw quite a number of experimentation by our youth to just get beyond the idea of traditional norms. We're going to get beyond the idea of our wars in Vietnam. We're going to get beyond having to keep our hair short. Why can't we be more liberated from many other different standpoints? And they've got a pretty good point. Okay, so from that standpoint, in the decade of the 1960s, you see a rise in the idea of modern Neo Leftism. Okay, some critics like to claim it's been influenced by Soviets, and Soviets infiltrated academia, and you have communists that came in and they tried to disrupt America. I don't know if I believe in any of that. I think that's kind of an empty argument, if you will. Otherwise, though, the idea of there being a new left is nothing new in American society. So you have Students for a Democratic Society that are essentially yesterday's current day democratic socialists. Very similar intentions, very similar ideals. Ironically, yesterday's hippies are today's old boomers who kind of have moved on from their old school views. Maybe perhaps the youthful enthusiasm and energy is very well intended, but experience and wisdom eventually win the day, perhaps. Kind of maybe recenter. I think that's what a lot of it is. But you do have quite a number of college campuses in the late 1960s who exist in the era of a free speech movement. And coming off civil rights and other aspects, you have people who reject norms. They oftentimes see college administrators as being perpetuators of elitism in the existing norm, when you have people who want to shake things up, mostly for good reason. And other times people get caught up in it because that's all they know. So, as you have a raging war in Vietnam in the late 1960s, which is continuing to escalate despite the Tet Offensive or anything else of the sort, you have a lot of campus unrest. A lot of protests still exist and actually only amplify in the late 1960s as a result of our continued and expanding war in Vietnam. Something has to change. There's still quite a significant amount of unrest. Oftentimes you have campus sit-ins, you have college students who will protest riotously on campus. They'll storm an administration building and hold siege for a week or so until they have to be forcibly removed by law enforcement. That happens on a significant number of college campuses all throughout the United States in the late 1960s. And a lot of their protest isn't just opposed to the war in Vietnam, it's opposed to the draft as well. You see, a number of folks would receive a draft notice to where if you were drafted, you very likely are going to go serve with the U.S. Army or the Marines in Vietnam. Now, there were supposed to have been some exemptions at that time. If you were a college student in good standing, which means that you didn't have any disciplinary issues and your grades were up to par, then you had an exemption. Well, maybe if you weren't doing quite as well, maybe that could potentially be threatened. That said, oftentimes the college campus became the center for opposition to the war and the draft itself. So it only kind of adds to the unrest of the situation. And on college campuses, not only that, you also had an espousal of the idea of a counterculture, going against societal norm. Things that we consider normal in our society are anormal in a counterculture. So what you see is an entire generational movement of people who want to disengage from the normal. They're going to grow out their hair. Woolly, bushy hair, you're going to grow it out. You're not going to shave. You're going to grow out a beard. You're going to reject even the idea of other types of hygiene or anything else of the sort. You're going to have more of a movement towards a liberated society, especially women who want to maybe engage in sexual acts or whatnot without the judgment of society, or maybe people who want to do drugs. As I've mentioned in prior videos, LSD was very rampant around this time. Marijuana usage was growing around this time. Drug experimentation ran rampant. Even some of our troops in Vietnam would gain access to some of this type of stuff by the early 1970s or so. So, a lot of this movement was centered around the old Beatnik idea from the 50s. The Beatniks were those who rejected society's norms, the droning of the banality of the societal norms, people who rejected it. And in the 1960s, the Beatnik idea evolved into hippies. And oftentimes, hippies would evaluate and idealize the idea of a communal type experience, moving away perhaps to a rural area to live communally, so as to get away from the suburban drone, so as to get away from the quote unquote societal norm. They're going to create their own ideal. And they're going to do so under the idea of equality, but also personal fulfillment. And they're very well intentioned. And so there are various different things that come in with that. Hippies believe in personal fulfillment. They believe in an idea of moral relativity. If it feels good, do it. Free love, make love, not war. They reject the idea of the military-industrial complex, the idea of war over ideals. They reject the idea of violence. They reject the idea of inequality. Most people don't disagree with that. Okay? However, there are various different things that go on as a society at the time that still kind of hide hippies away, even though they're very vocal. I mentioned in the last chapter Haight Asbury, which is that intersection of Haight and Asbury there in San Francisco, and I talked about the music influence with Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, and those types of folks. Yeah, San Francisco became the idea, the very idea itself for the counterculture movement. Hippies largely centered their ideas of a counterculture in San Francisco. And of course, it spread all throughout the country, largely on many college campuses. The University of California at Berkeley, for the better part of 10 years, would see college campus riots and protests on a very regular basis from the mid 1960s to the mid 1970s or so, especially in the Vietnam era. It's commonplace. Well, Berkeley's right over by San Francisco. Okay, so you have a pretty heavy influence there. You also have the youth movement energized not just by this new left ideology, but also by music at the time. So again, in the last chapter, we talked about some of the music phenomenons like the Doors, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, your classic 60s acid rock, and other types of musical styles were influenced by society's ills and the rejection thereof. A rejection of the war in Vietnam, a rejection of quote unquote normalcy, societal cultural norms, rejecting all that. So 60s rock music oftentimes espouses the idea of embracing a counterculture, embracing going against the grain. You don't have to be a drone. If it feels good, do it. End the war in Vietnam. That was the large and embraced sentiment of music at the time, which mirrored that of the counterculture movement in the New Left and the youth movement. So, you have great music at the time. So that's some of my very favorite music. As a matter of fact, in the last slide, or in the last chapter, I linked a YouTube video for the Doors. Come on, baby, light my fire. That's one of my favorite songs. I love the Doors. That musical style is heavily influenced by not just societal times, but perhaps by LSD. It's very trippy. 60s vernacular, if you will. So much so that in the 1960s and late 1969, the United States is at our height of our involvement in Vietnam. We had 540,000 troops in Vietnam. You have a large counterculture movement going on across the country, and the biggest icon and symbol of American counterculture is the large concert that took place at Woodstock on a farm in upstate New York, outside of Woodstock. Almost 400,000 people congregated. Almost, it just kind of came this phenomenon that exploded overnight, if you will, where all of a sudden many of these cultural music icons would play at a concert at Woodstock, and before you know it, there were thousands and thousands of people there. It rained, it was very muddy, they didn't have things like porta potties or concessions or anything else like that. It's pretty nasty. But so many of the biggest musical acts of the time were there, like Jimi Hendrix. Okay. Woodstock in the summer of 1969 is the ultimate appeal for the counterculture. Now, the counterculture kind of took a bit of a hit when later on that year, in December of 1969, a very similar concert headlined by the Rolling Stones took place near San Francisco. And a significant number of violent acts occurred, including some people who were murdered as the Rolling Stones were playing on stage. And there would be actual video footage that came out at the time that actually showed one of the people getting stabbed, if you will. That put a stain on the whole hippie movement. What further put a stain on the hippie movement were the Charles Manson murders. You see, Charles Manson was a known hippie who lived communally, who espoused the idea of strife. He wanted to pit people against each other. And when it was uncovered that he was trying to murder various different Hollywood icons and actually accomplished that, people made a parallel about how he comes from the counterculture, how he is a self-identified hippie that lives in a communal type living. That kind of put a stain on the counterculture hippie movement. And that's what kind of slowed things down from that movement a little bit going on into the 1970s. So you have some things, people tripping up over themselves, they're very well intentioned, but then there are other things that happen that kind of slow things down. Otherwise, though, the youth culture that emerged from the decade of the 1960s further changed American society. So, yeah, today we have the whole, okay, boomer phenomenon. Yesterday's boomers used to be today's youth society. Okay? So, that's something to think about with youth culture rather. Woodstock, iconic. 60s music, iconic. Here we go.